Welcome to Fraser Fast Track, the Fraser Institute's look at some of the week's key news stories. I'm Leah Costello. This week we're joined by Karol Boudreaux, a lecturer at George Mason University, discussing the role of foreign aid in Africa's economic development. Poverty is an important issue internationally. With the global financial crisis, there is less government available for foreign aid. Karol, as well as teaching on this subject, you're the lead researcher for an organization called Enterprise Africa, an organization that investigates, analyzes, and reports on enterprise-based solutions to end poverty in Africa. Can you first tell us how you define foreign aid?
Sure. There are different kinds of foreign aid, and what most of your viewers are probably familiar with is something called official development assistance, which is money that's transferred from governments or from international financial organizations to sovereign nations in the developing world. But this is just one component of foreign aid. Other kinds of foreign aid would be things like remittances, which are payments that individuals make to families and friends in other parts of the world, or private charitable giving, or even things like NGO activity in other parts of the world. So foreign aid should be considered to be a fairly broad set of activities, not just the activities of one nation giving money to another nation.
There is persistent debate on how to promote economic growth and shrink poverty in the developing world. Does foreign aid work?
Foreign aid has a very, very mixed history. It would be fair to say that there are some foreign aid efforts that have probably done a reasonable amount of good in the world. So for example, efforts to eradicate smallpox were funded in large part by foreign aid, and those do seem to have worked reasonably well. Some other kinds of immunization efforts, such as immunizing children against polio, have worked reasonably well. But for the most part, most foreign aid has really not accomplished what donor nations intended for it to accomplish, or rather, it's probably fair to say, most foreign aid hasn't accomplished what taxpayers thought it would accomplish when politicians suggested to them that their money was going to be used to lift millions and millions of people out of poverty. We haven't seen a kind of direct connection between spending on foreign aid and poverty alleviation that taxpayers would have liked to have seen. It doesn't mean that private philanthropic efforts don't work very well. It doesn't mean that a very narrow group of public sector efforts haven't worked. But it's fair to say that overall most public sector efforts have not worked for a variety of reasons that we could probably discuss if you're interested in discussing those.
There is persistent debate on how to promote economic growth and shrink poverty in the developing world. Does foreign aid work?
There's definitely signs of growth, especially in Africa over the last 7 to 8 years. Sort of the unsung story of sub-Saharan Africa for these last several years has been that there's been very strong economic growth, especially in East Africa and parts of West Africa. Growth rates in some of these countries have been averaging 6–7% a year. At the same time, macroeconomic factors such as inflation rates, controlling debt, controlling government spending have really come under control. And this is a very encouraging sign for many countries in East Africa, Central Africa. In Southern Africa, there's been some very good stability for a long period of time now. Your viewers may be familiar, for example, with the case of Botswana, which is often cited as one of the great success stories in sub-Saharan Africa. It's a country that's had very strong economic growth rates for decades now and has been able to avoid a problem that many other African countries have had to deal with, and that's the problem of the resource curse. It's a country that has a lot of mineral wealth. It has mineral wealth in terms of diamonds, but having that wealth hasn't led to the kinds of problems of corruption and actually low growth rates that other countries like Angola and some of the West African countries have experienced. So there are encouraging signs in Africa. Whether the current financial crisis will dampen some of those good experiences, I think remains to be seen. But there's a lot to be encouraged about actually in Africa now. And that's not even beginning to mention the fact that there are increasingly really interesting entrepreneurial activities in Africa that are connecting up to the global marketplace. And so African entrepreneurs increasingly are part of the world that we as consumers in the West experience. And that's terrific for Africans. It's terrific for us as well.
You are a member of the Working Group on Property Rights in the UN's Commission on Legal Empowerment of the Poor. What advice do you have for governments now that are considering cuts to foreign aid?
Well, a lot of countries are cutting their foreign aid as a result of the financial crisis this year and last year. I think the important thing to do when it comes to foreign aid is really carefully track how the money is being spent. And unfortunately, it's very difficult for most foreign aid agencies, whether they're multilateral agencies like the World Bank or whether they're bilateral giving agencies like USAID or the Canadian agency. It's very difficult for agencies to really track the effectiveness of their grants. And so I think for taxpayers, but also for the sake of being sure that the aid money reaches the people on the ground for whom it's intended, it's important really to institute more effective outcome measurements for foreign aid. It's important to understand, for example, if you have a literacy program that you're funding at the end of a year, at the end of 3 years, at the end of 5 years, are people actually more literate than today at that point than they were when you started? And that kind of tracking of outcomes is not done in any sort of systematic way today in development agencies. That's something that really absolutely must be addressed. In addition to doing things like being much more careful about overhead, how is overhead being spent in development agencies? And that means things like, are there opportunities to partner with people on the ground in the developing world to carry out some of the contracts that aid agencies implement? So let me give you a quick example. USAID, the United States lead development agency, spends billions of dollars a year. Where does much of this money go? Much of it goes to U.S. contractors who implement programs on the ground in the developing world. Well, in many cases, those programs could actually be run by people in sub-Saharan Africa who have local knowledge about the problems, who have capabilities, who would be able to benefit from implementing those projects. But for a variety of reasons, whether it's lobbying efforts or other reasons, many of those projects are instead contracted out to U.S. folks. And that's one area where I think there's a lot of room for improvement. That's using local partners on the ground in the developing world.
Thanks, Karol. And thanks for joining us this week. To make sure that you receive our episodes as soon as they're posted, make sure that you've subscribed to our Fraser Institute channel on YouTube or to the RSS feed at fraserinstitute.org/multimedia. We'll see you next week for Fraser Fast Track.